What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health. Welcome to Madness Radio. This is your host, Will Hall, and today our guest is Rob Wipond. Rob is a freelance investigative journalist who writes frequently at the interfaces between psychiatry, civil rights, policing, surveillance and privacy, and social change. His articles have been nominated for 17 magazine and journalism awards for writing in medicine, science and technology, business and law, and also works and volunteers with nonprofit groups that do neighborhood community building. Rob's latest book, which is highly recommended by Madness Radio, is Your Consent is Not Required: The Rise in Psychiatric Detentions, Forced Treatment, and Abusive Guardianships. So welcome to Madness Radio, Rob Wipond.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I'm a fan.
And I'm a fan. I was a fan of your work. We've known each other for 15 plus years. And I just want to say this, please, read this book. This book is absolutely essential reading. I think this is an extraordinary thing that you have done. It feels like as significant as a milestone and advance for the movement, for the cause of human rights and mental health, as Robert Whitaker's publication of Anatomy of an Epidemic. And I just hope and pray that this book gets out there and is read and creates as much of a vortex of response and provocation and inspiration. And I just want to say congratulations. And on behalf of myself and also people that I work with, the broader movement, I think we owe you a tremendous thanks for writing this book. Thank you so much for writing this book, Rob.
Well, thank you, Will. And yeah, let's fully acknowledge who's in the book. You know, the many people who've been subjected to psychiatric detentions and forced treatment, who shared their stories with me, not only the ones that are in the book, but over a 20-year period that I've been researching these issues. You know, it's really so much their voice, their energy, their blood, you know, that runs through that. And I want to make sure as much as possible that I'm always redirecting some of that, the praise that I get to hear. You know, I'm fortunate enough to hear from those readers who get something of value from the book. You know, sometimes I'll even ask them, oh, what story touched you, so that I can relay it to that source and say, hey, you've got a fan out there, they were really moved by your story. And yeah, so I just want to emphasize that. And the other thing is I'm really honored by that comparison. You know, of course, I've done work with Robert Whitaker at Mad in America, but that isn't why I say this, you know, why I'm honored by that comparison with Anatomy of an Epidemic. But it's because I can't tell you how many people I've interviewed who say that book changed their lives, you know, for the better. And wow, you know, what more can a writer or anybody that works in this kind of field ask for, you know, than to have touched people in that kind of way? And yeah, so if this book could in some way, that someone would say to me, hey, that book changed my life in a positive way, boy, that's awesome. So I really value that comparison because of my on the ground experience of people just spontaneously telling me, well, in the middle of their story, and then I read Anatomy of Epidemic, and oh boy, things changed, you know?
Well, it's an extraordinary book. And one of the reasons I'm so excited about helping to get this book out there is because of your own grounding in community development work, community advocacy, and community building. And, you know, someone asked me about this, and I said that this book really represents what advocacy really is about. It's about lifting the voice of people who have been voiceless. And that's really what you're doing here. And I think that's what Bob did. And I want to say also to people, this is a very painful topic, just as medications is a painful topic. We're talking about violence. We're talking about torture, essentially. We're talking about kidnapping and assault, which has all been normalized and sanitized and euphemismized and Orwellian transformed into these bureaucratic words to cover up what is essentially a large-scale murderous violence happening globally. And your book, I think, truly represents honestly what is going on. It's an unflinching look at the darkness of psychiatry, which we absolutely have to look at. And at the same time, this was a hard book. Even as I celebrate this book, and I feel so seen by this book and seen by your work because I'm a survivor of forced psychiatric treatment, psychiatric violence. My father is a survivor of psychiatric violence. I have so many friends who have died. I had people who have been injured, people who have. I'm so deeply connected with this book, even as I celebrate it and am inspired by it. It was hard. It was really hard for me to start reading it, and I just want to recognize those listeners that, hey, if this might be a difficult topic for us to dive into, and just to acknowledge that, and because I know personally it's difficult for me, so that's one of the things I'm kind of balancing is my inspiration and my interest and my appreciation and my learning, but also like, wow, I still have these wounds, and even though my own experience with psychiatric incarceration and violence was in the late 90s, those wounds are still very alive for me. Sitting down with your book, I start to feel the traumatic response, the triggering, and I have to kind of think about, okay, what's going on here? It's not because I'm not paying attention or I'm not trying hard enough or I'm not focusing enough on the book. Oh, I'm having memories come up. And I would like to say that I'm recovered and healed from this. I'm certainly working on it, but like I think most of us, when we have extreme violence happen to us, it is an ongoing process. So I just want to say that and to honor that. And I want to also congratulate you and honor you for how sensitively you have approached this topic. The thing that was most powerful for me, Rob, sitting down with your book is that you start with a personal story. And I'm very, very sorry to hear about what happened with your father. And I'm so glad that the story does take a turn in a positive direction. But maybe you could just say a little bit about, your own experience with this and how you got interested. And I'm also especially interested in what you bring as a journalist who's committed to community building treatment, because I know you've been working on this for more than 20 years. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, for 25 years, I've been basically off and on researching this issue. In fact, that's part of it. I actually, um, for much of the reasons you described already, actually stopped writing about civil rights in the mental health system because I just couldn't handle it anymore at a period in my life. I just thought, I got to write about something else. And then everything else I chose, I was a community-based, on-the-ground journalist, interested in social issues generally. Well, I'd look at policing. Well, I'd look at health issues. Well, I'd look at poverty. Well, I'd look at, you name it in a community. And guess what would suddenly appear again? Oh, there's people being forcibly treated. And that actually was a huge, huge element of why I wanted to write a book about this right there. So we'll have the personal thing I'll talk about in a second. But it was this realization by working in one community where I became widely recognized because my photo was there in the publication that I was writing for all the time. People would say, "Hey, I saw you." I became very aware of how permeating the mental health system is in our society and how widely the mental health laws are being used against this extraordinary range of people that just is not being covered by anyone else. Because as a national journalist, you won't see this. You have to be a community journalist to see it.
And Rob, I think this is why the comparison with Anatomy of an Epidemic is apt, because there's like a widespread mythology or propaganda marketing deception that antipsychotic medications, psychiatric drugs are just benevolent, latest, effective treatments for mental illness, and the field is innovating and treatment outcomes are improving. Anatomy of an Epidemic sort of crystallized all the critiques that shattered that mythology, and I think that that's exactly what your book is doing. Is you're bringing together all these voices and all these criticisms and all this pushback into this moment that is fundamentally saying, no, this is a myth, that this is somehow an acceptable, positive, helpful, recovery oriented, progressive medical intervention to force people into hospitals and to force them into taking drugs. You're naming it for what it is, a failure and a form of widespread violence.
I want to highlight like what I'm learning is most people have no idea what forced psychiatric treatment is. And it's not even like there's a much of a propaganda system out there describing it in some other way. People just sort of operate with this weird assumption that's floating out there that the involuntary treatment is roughly like we pull you into a psychiatric hospital. They understand that police may be involved. We pull you into a psychiatric hospital, and then they just have this amorphous sort of understanding that they talk to you, they persuade you to take some drugs, you take them, you're spontaneously happy.
You have a safe space to be, you kind of get to rest, you're sort of protected for a while. Yeah.
Exactly. And you feel so good about being there. And you take this drug and you miraculously instantly start feeling better, so much better that you're like, thank you. You're thanking everyone as if you were just in a car crash and they repaired you on the operating table and you've woken up.
Hey, they're doctors, there's angels, they're saviors. Thank you so much. If you're in a crisis, call 911. They'll come and help you. Don't worry, we're here to help.
Exactly. And this is the image that somehow, even though you won't see that described anywhere, I've never seen that written out in any block by, point by point form in a publication, but this is somehow the belief that just been absorbed into people's consciousness.
It's the right thing to do. Call the authorities, get someone hospitalized. It's the responsible thing to do.
Yeah. And so we need to emphasize that what I kind of say is there is such a thing as nominally involuntary. That's the term I think I might have invented, nominally involuntary. So that means it kind of does play out a little bit like that. Maybe your family kind of persuades you to go to the hospital. You go, you are seeking help, you are feeling distressed. And the doctor talks to you very respectfully and politely about what you've been going through and says, would you like to try these drugs? We kind of think, and I'm really sorry, but we're kind of worried about you, so we may need to detain you. Really sorry. It's like that's the conversation. And I call that nominally involuntary. You take the drug, you try it, you are thankful. You do benefit because some people do like the effects of these drugs, right? And so they work it out. Could I have a slightly lower dose? Yes, of course. Why not? Is that working for you? Wonderful. Bye-bye. I think that does happen
On occasion, yeah, on occasion.
on occasion. Yeah, exactly. I can't say I actually met many people.
I have, but it doesn't somehow negate the overwhelming number of other people. Exactly.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. And that's way more common. And so what I try to say is, okay, we have nominally involuntary. That isn't really what the book's about, although I do touch on it and all of that. What true forced treatment is that the person says no. And they may say no because for whatever reason they don't want to even try those drugs or whatever other treatment is being offered, like electroshock or something else, or they have tried them and they say, no, I've tried it and I did not like it. It did not make me feel better. Or they do try it right in the moment and say, okay, I'm not liking this. Can we stop this now? So it's one of those scenarios. In that scenario, this is what my book is mainly about. What happens then? And what happens then is, and people need to understand this if they've never experienced it or seen it, is security guards come in, restraints are used, physical restraints. People are forcibly stripped if they've refused to strip. They're injected with needles in their bare bottoms, while they're thrashing and screaming sometimes. And this is a heavy tranquilizing medication. Sometimes it'll be several antipsychotics and sedatives all wrapped together in one dose that can literally knock somebody out. And that's the kind of medication, quote unquote, that they're getting. And then this can extend further into control in the hospital. You may not be allowed to have visitors. They may decide that they don't like your family and they don't want your family there advocating in your behalf. They'll just prevent them from showing up. There are a range of rights that people can lose. And so that's what this book is about, is what's actually happening. So I had a few run-ins with friends of mine being detained in psychiatric hospitals for brief periods. So I knew it existed and I had some concern in the back of my mind hovering there. I'd always been interested in non-ordinary states of consciousness and different ways of seeing the world. I'd always kind of seen myself as somebody who was kind of creative and different and outside the boxes. And that was the world I lived in. And so I did read books like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest or people like R.D. Laing and, a variety of things as a young person. So that was kind of hovering in the back of my mind when in 1997, my father had surgery that left him with some serious repercussions. So he was understandably going through a difficult period emotionally. And he sought help at the local psychiatric hospital, went in there with my mother and my brother, and was promptly detained against his will. Now, this was a career college professor of computer engineering, someone with no history of quote unquote mental health issues, and and understandably going through a very difficult time. Nevertheless, he got certified and forcibly treated very quickly, which shocked me. And then the shock deepened as I witnessed how these drugs that he was given first affected him to the point that he could, really just wasn't helping his awareness at all. He seemed to become physically debilitated by them. They were changing all the time. He had sought help there. He certainly didn't see himself as
Mm.
certifiable and that he should lose all his rights. And I think we were all shocked at how easily that happened and just how grim an atmosphere the hospital really was for him. I think at the level that, my mother was worried and my brother was concerned. For them, it was a little more like, this is the time to go to doctors. I was more in the mode of, when I had spent some time there, it's like, you'll get through it, Dad. It'll be all right. But I had left, and my brother had, hearing my mother's concerns, they were anxious, and they just felt it was the right thing to do. So it was, they cajoled and persuaded, and my dad agreed. It was sort of a mix. It was coercive, you might say, right? I think he was like, okay, a bit, I'll try it. And he kind of started to spin out. And this is something that happens too, right? These drugs have mind altering effects. So how people start talking and responding can be significantly affected. And what I do know and what I recount in the book is none of these drugs were helping. He was just actually getting worse. And we started to kind of say, can't he just sort of be here without drugs? Just safe in the hospital. Maybe that is good for him, but just time to kind of be with himself in an environment where he won't threaten anyone or anything like that. And they were like, no, no, we treat diseases at hospitals. This is what we do. And now we want to do electroconvulsive therapy. And we were like, what? You still do that? What? All of that. And we got oh, it's a myth that it causes brain damage. Oh, it's a myth that it causes memory loss. It'll, it's all fine. It's all great. It's, all this stuff. And yeah, but as I recount through that chapter, he got steadily worse. The electroshock was extremely damaging. He ultimately lost permanently the entire year surrounding the electroshocks. He still today barely remembers anything from that period.
And all during the time that he's getting worse, they're saying, no, 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 this is his disease. He's actually needs more treatment.
That's right. And he was saying no. Like at the beginning of the electroshock, he very clearly articulated to them, to me, I don't want this. I'm scared of it. I don't like it. And they did it anyway.
And this is the darkest part of this, is that people with good intentions will see the suffering of another person. They will see right in front of them the person saying no. They will see this person's suffering worsen. And instead of responding to the person, they will respond to their training and their conditioning and their authority and their brainwashing, really, in the medical industrial complex, to disregard the humanity of that person right in front of them and to go with continuing to inflict harm on them. And it reminds me of the Stanley Milgram experiment that was part of MK Ultra, where the people will just continue to administer shocks to an actor in another room that they don't see, but they're hearing the person screaming, but they'll continue to administer shocks because they're in an authority relationship with a doctor, and the doctor is saying, no, no, go ahead and keep doing this. This is one of the most disturbing things about both your father's story and also what happens throughout the system, is what is the glue of obedience that holds all this together?
Yeah, well, we do have this very toxic notion circulating that's relevant in my father's case as well, of lack of insight, right? This is the concept, the term that's used in some jurisdictions. It's actually embedded in the laws. This notion that once you've got a mental disorder diagnosis, nothing you say can really be trusted. You don't have insight. And usually it boils down to, do you agree or disagree with the psychiatrist? If the psychiatrist says, this is what I think, this is your diagnosis, this is the drug, and you say, okay, that sounds great, that's demonstrated insight. If you say, no, I don't agree, I don't believe in that diagnosis, I don't trust this science, that particular drug, I do not like it, now you're demonstrating lack of insight. That's pretty much what it boils down to in practice.
That's what they told you about your father. They just said, "Oh, he's not really suffering. He just has no awareness of what is going on with his disease."
Well, it's built into the criteria. So the moment that they certified him under the laws in that jurisdiction of British Columbia, the stamp on the form literally says unable to recognize the need for treatment and their own condition, is something to that effect. So it's built right in that this was their interpretation of him. Here is a person whose word, whose perspective ultimately has no value. And this is something that I return to repeatedly, and I dedicate an entire chapter of the book simply to this issue of insight alone, because it's so crucial to how we justify forcibly treating people.
It's really the moment of dehumanization. You lose the human capacity to have, and we should, if we step back a little bit. I mean, I've known people that have strokes. I know someone who was in a coma, and there are medical conditions where it is true the person is in a position of a physical illness or an injury or stroke or something where that, but the problem is that that framework is then imported incorrectly into something that's not that at all. It's something completely different. And then that's why it's so important to understand the disease model is often the origins of this kind of dehumanization, because yeah, we will strap someone down and we will do surgery to them, and we'll all see violence. Surgeries are quite violent, but they're not in the sense of you're respecting the human reality of the person. There's true consent. There actually is a disease process. You're taking out a tumor. There's a reason to tie the person down during the surgery. But that medical logic is completely not correct, accurate, real for the kinds of situations that we're talking about, which are human experiences where subjectivity and emotions and consent really need to be listened to in a very, very different way than a kind of a disease model that, oh, you have a head injury, therefore we have to restrain you. That's completely false to make that reference. Yeah.
My dad is actually a really good example in that sense too, because he certainly was saying things from time to time in that period that were weird, and things that you might not believe, or if you took it literally, you'd kind of say, no, that's not true. Like he'd say, like, the ceiling is caving in, and you would look and, no, the ceiling's not literally caving in right now. But he took that as it was his feeling, right?
As metaphor for his experience.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of us do feel the ceiling is caving in an era of ecocide and climate catastrophe and political disintegration. The ceiling does seem like it's coming down.
Exactly. And of course, when you get into a heightened state, that can also alter your behavior somewhat. Like, another example was that he felt that the furnace might blow up. Again, very much how he was feeling. And yet then he proceeded to say, okay, we need to call the gas company to check the furnace. And you can imagine if we'd let him do that 100 times in a day, not that I knew he would do that, but if that had happened, then okay, they'd say, this guy's certifiable, get him locked up, right? But of course, it's actually a reasonable response, because his belief was it's going to blow up. And so he's doing the thing that he was trained to do, which is be a responsible gentleman, as my father always was, right? And so he's not that disconnected from reality. And the reality is, he would say that, and then you kind of go, oh, come on, dad, you would get him on, another topic, and he would be his ordinary rational self, right? So it was also just something fluid, moving off and on, right? No reason to discredit his value as a human being.
I see that a lot, that one moment of apparent weirdness or extreme, like out of touch with reality, is then used to disqualify entirely. Like suddenly whereas actually, I mean, gosh, it's so often that someone who has a very strange belief that you wouldn't be able to maybe verify is perfectly capable and totally grounded and completely connected with so-called reality in the vast majority of the rest. But everyone is focusing on this one little thing to disqualify them and say, oh, that's the presence of the this is the microbe that we found under the microscope, and therefore the disease is present, and therefore the person just has this disordered thinking, and now we can just open the door to completely negating their own choice and their own subjective reality, and because we claim that they lack insight.
That's right. That's right. And that is widespread. That is just so common that this is done. I call it, it's like a caricaturization of people, right? Like I even say, you make up this image of, oh, it's a homeless person who's chasing aliens and he's wandering into traffic. I'm like, okay, I think that happens at times, but then what happens? Does that person have any friends? You know, did they go for lunch today? Are they making sure they get dinner? Because often they are. Guess what? If you offered them a home to get out of the rainy day, do you think they'd take it? I bet they would. I meet these people. Yes. You know, people go, have you ever seen someone psychotic? And I'm like, yeah, I've lived with people. I've seen, you know, they're friends of mine, you know, and yes, I see them on the street as well. And often if you stop long enough to not be afraid and talk to the person, you find, oh, there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on that's relevant here. And what else, you know?
And to be quite frank, with reading the story with your family, I mean, the providers seem way more crazy than him, because they're the ones who are continually administering treatments that are making him worse, going against his wishes and ignoring simple complaints or simple objections, and then coming up with these completely outlandish, ridiculous, some of the things that they told your family are just ridiculous on the face of them.
I mean, one of my examples is that, you know, they said at one point when after 9 rounds of electroshock, you know, he got better for about a week and a half and then just plunged right back to his state. And they said, oh, well, you know, it's like we're trying to fill a gas tank and we didn't quite, you know, put enough gas in. So now we're going to do 12 shocks in 3 weeks. And, you know, you can't help but be really disturbed by medical doctors talking about the functioning of the human brain with such a ridiculous analogy, which really it speaks to their lack of sensitivity, really, to the complexity of the situation.
It's widespread, and it just leans on their authority. Oh, they must be right. They're the ones with the training. People talk about, oh, I'm going to reset my brain. That's something we hear in psychedelic therapy. You're going to reset your brain. Oh, your mind is a computer. Oh, okay. Well, that's a very sophisticated insight that you had. Or actually, when I was hospitalized, this is a story I've told many times. They were considering electroconvulsive. They changed the name of. They rebranded it. Oh, it's different now. It's not electroshock therapy. It's electroconvulsive therapy. They wanted to give me electroconvulsive therapy, and one of the things that the doctors said, he said, well, we don't know how it works. I can't even believe that he said this to me when as I'm remembering it, but he really did say this, and it was a rehearsed kind of thing that I know that he has said to other patients. He says, well, you know, we really don't know how electroshock works, but you know how a TV, when it doesn't have a good signal, you kind of hit it on the top and then suddenly it'll come in. That's literally what he said to me, is to convince me. And the heartbreaking thing is that because I come in with some privilege, some college education, some critical thinking, I know how to talk back to authority a bit because of how I was raised and my own experience. I was be able to be skeptical, but so many people just sort of bow their heads and they do the right thing socially, which is defer to the authority of this person who is. Fortunately, I did not end up doing the. My father did. My father had multiple electroshock therapies back in the days when anesthesia was not used, and it was clearly a punishment for him as a young man when he was in the state hospital. And that's one of the things that comes across so clearly in your book, is that there is an uninterrupted continuity in the violence and abuses of the psychiatric system. We have not entered into some enlightened age where we learned the lessons of the dark past and now we have a new psychiatric system. No, it's not only is it continuing, but it's actually getting worse because of the magnitude of forced treatment and the magnitude of forcing people onto drugs in the community, which you speak to, which is one of the big surprising things about your research, is that this problem has gotten worse and worse, even as we're told, well, you know, there's less state hospitals now, so there's not as many beds. Well, actually, that's not true. There's lots of beds and there's lots of forced treatment happening. So I was very struck by the crazy making moment when this authority figure says something just completely ludicrous to you, and you're just powerless. You just have to kind of swallow it, because it happens so many times in the mental health system that the providers put their own lack of being out of touch with reality, their own lack of insight on display so flagrantly, and then they use it to exert their power. So the story with your father and that happened kept repeating, that your family would ask again and again, well, what about this? Or maybe we should do this, or maybe this, and they would just come back to you. That really resonated with my own experience and so many other stories and people that I've talked to and friends and people in the community and people I work with, that really crazy making moment that the psychiatric system gets away with so often.
Yeah, well, when someone's staring into your eyes saying you're insane, you've lost touch with reality, people often will go one way or the other, understandably, right? They'll either go, yes, yes, ma'am, yes, sir, okay, tell me then what to do. How can I save myself? There's this transition of power in that moment that can completely send somebody down a different life trajectory. Or they say, screw you, you're the crazy one, and that becomes their life trajectory. And I think, much like being assaulted in other ways, it's unfortunate, right? Because we all know that life is more nuanced than that, right? That we all have a bit of craziness in us, and we all have a bit of sanity. And sometimes the craziness is the good side of us, and sometimes the sanity is the bad side, and vice versa. And for every person, and it's fluid and it's changing, right? So that's reality. We all know that. It is and so it's really unfortunate. And I think that this is one of the polarizations that occurs in the system, and the psychiatrists are at the root of it because they have all the power in this situation, right? They should be the ones that are bringing nuance to the situation and saying, okay, I understand that you might see me in this way right now, but I am really trying to help you. How can I help you? Right? Make it a collaborative enterprise, truly the way they tell us they're doing it. That part has been propagandized in the media, right? That it is a collaborative, and of course for some people they've experienced it that way, but that is not what's happening predominantly in our psychiatric hospitals or in psychiatric wards when people are being enforcibly treated.
So what happened with your father? Let's get back to that aspect of the story. He did electroshock therapy. He kind of improved for a couple of weeks or a week, and then they said he needed more to fill the tank, which is actually consistent with the work of Peter Bregan and Linda Andre, about that if there is any efficacies, if there is any positive effect from electroshock therapy, it's kind of like a head trauma. If you hit someone in the head, sometimes they will sort of, oh, I feel better now, I don't have the pain. And if you're hitting them also with an immersed placebo expectation that you do this big ritualized treatment and that you're going to get better, but then it doesn't last. And it sounds like that's what happened with your father, is that eventually the whatever positive benefit so called that he got didn't last with the electroshock. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So he got basically worse to the point where he was very debilitated, didn't really know who he was or where he was. I wasn't sure he could recognize me, really. We could still converse, but he was very docile, just very out of it. And at that point, we kind of argued to them, look, you know, clearly this guy can't be said to be a danger to anything or anyone because he's barely functional, and they seemed tired of him, and so they let him go in the care of my mother. And she was fortunately retired as well so that she could take care of him, and so she did. And she was an amazing woman, and she provided for him, provided all the kind of support you would hope anyone would get in that kind of situation. And by this point we had all sort of given up on the mental health system, so she felt motivated then to go, okay, I just got to care for him directly at home.
So then your mom provided him basically with the care that he needed, which was just patience and sanctuary and support and believing in him and having faith that he'll get better. And
Yeah, that's right. And he started to kind of return a bit. He's always been very self-motivated sort of man. And they had given him a sedative, Ativan, to continue to take. Ironically, that was the drug that made him feel the best. So you kind of go, how does a sedative help with depression? Of course, because depression's related to anxiety, and anxiety is related to psychosis. And it's like, because all these things are really just about people having stressful experiences, right?
Ativan's a nice high. You gotta admit it. Maybe he needed a break.
That's right. And so I gave him research showing it's addictive. nature. He was on a very small dose. He weaned himself off on his own without even telling anyone he was doing it. And so, yeah, and he had another good 10 years with my mom after that. Like most of his long-term memories returned, but not that year around the electroshock. And often he did lose huge gaps. So even just recently, I was speaking with some of his sisters, and they were saying that they were still like concerned about those chunks of memory he had lost. So it was pretty devastating.
I'm so glad he was able to come back home and he was able to regain so much of his life that he had lost and regain his memory and came out of the depression, even though there were some serious injuries that happened.
Yeah, but you know, one thing he lost, which isn't often talked about, and I think it needs to be, is it was because of that loss of memory caused by the ECT. He never had a picture that he had gone through a difficult time and managed to get through. That thing that can empower you as a person to say, hey, I've been in the darkness, but you know what? I remember now. Eventually I did feel better. Eventually whatever it was, I found new people in my life. New opportunities. He
Oh,
forgot that eventually he did heal himself, right?
oh,
Like
oh.
he had lost that period of time. So then he had these vague memories, and we would relay to him some of what happened, and he was horrified and it frightened him. And so that's what he was ultimately left with, absolute terror of, if I ever need help, I'm desperately afraid of what could happen because I know what happened.
I just, yeah, it's very powerful, very touching. It's reminding me of my own father, who at some point later in his life, he started to recognize that he needed some kind of support, some kind of counseling, some kind of therapy, which he had been completely objected to his whole life. He had been completely not interested in any of that. And he said to me that he had gone and talked, because he's a veteran. He was in the Korean War, and he told me, I remember this. He told me that he had gone and talked to the folks at the VA, the Veterans Administration Hospital in his area in South Carolina, and he asked them straight out, if I start to go into counseling and things get rough for me, are you guys going to maybe put me back in the hospital? And what he said was, and maybe to their credit, they said, well, yes, of course, if you start to struggle too much, we're going to have to put you back in the hospital. And then he completely turned away from that. He was not going to risk that. He was absolutely terrified of being forced back into the hospital, to the point of not taking a step towards care. I mean, his story is a little bit different because a lot of people, they don't know that they're stepping into that, but he really was trying to get help. And so it's so tragic that they just were completely unwilling, when it was so clear what he needed. They were just so unwilling to actually provide him safe, consent-based, voluntary counseling.
I subsequently discovered in my research that it's extremely rare for people to be offered anything else in psychiatric wards or psychiatric hospitals in North America.
It also makes me think that even when counseling is offered or therapy is offered, just as you said, the force permeates so much that if you cross a line, if you become have suicidal feelings, or if the therapist or counselor doesn't feel safe, whatever that word means, then you can get forced into treatment. I actually had an experience recently where I was curious about one of these chat counseling services offered by the Trevor Project, which is specific to LGBTQ people. And I think it's especially for youth. And so I started chatting, and I asked whether my IP address and my location might be tracked down. And the person who was chatting with me would not tell me one way or the other. And then finally they said, well, yes, we just want to keep you safe. And it was clear that supposedly in this confidential setting, I was going to be under threat of forced treatment. And talking with other people about this is so widespread, with suicide hotlines and counseling and chat counseling and all these different services that are available now. Without that basic trust and safety, how do you actually get support and help if that fear is around? And so many people are driven away from care because they're afraid of going back into the system or having violence happen to them.
Yeah, and it does raise that question of, I don't understand how mental health practitioners can think that they can reasonably and function in this environment. I'm surprised that more of them aren't publicly speaking out against forced treatment, because surely they know that this is just contributing to a widespread fear and widespread lack of help seeking.
And it's so common when you call a counselor or therapist on their voicemail or their email will say, if you have a crisis, call 911. It's just this reflexive thing. They're funneling people right into the medical industrial complex, right into the carceral care system, just without even thinking about it, because that's what their colleagues do. That's probably what they were taught in school. And it's again, it's normalized.
It's so important to highlight, how traumatizing these experiences can be for people. This is just so widespread. And again, it's shocking to me that more mental health practitioners are not speaking out against forced treatment themselves, because they see this on a daily basis and they're told it constantly by their own patients. It, it's often a lifelong trauma for people. And the worst part of it is the people who have suffered already. So we have this wide range of people who are ending up in the psychiatric system who have experienced childhood abuse, sexual abuse, assault, rape, all sorts of brutality in their lives, maybe from the time they were children onwards. And and they are really struggling from that. And then they end up in a system that reproduces some of the same traumas. They're immediately disempowered. They're forcibly stripped. They're restrained. Like, these are things that these are the fundamental traumas that people have experienced. And now the supposed helpers, the people they turn to for help, are imposing this kind of on them. And it's brutal. And it becomes like so tragically scary, because now they can't trust anyone. They were already, this is one of the most common effects of childhood trauma, is that it's hard to trust people. And now the people you've turned to for help, it's like the people who, have a problem in their community and turn to the police, and the police beat them up, right? Those people never feel safe again anywhere. And we have this vast swath of the population that's having that kind of experience in the mental health system. It's terrible. And it's not just isolated cases at all. Doctors will tell me this repeatedly. Oh, you're just talking to an isolated case. But if I look at the actual medical records some of these same doctors wrote, they don't portray those cases as isolated or unique at all in the medical records. So I know this is widespread common. So let's get clear on that, very clear about what forced treatment really is and how brutal it can be.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
I found some things that were just so dark, even for me to handle, that I couldn't work after for like days. And one of the decisions I made when I decided what to include and not to include in the book was, I decided that I knew there'd be a tolerance, a limitation in my readers for how much darkness they could handle. But I also thought, all right, I'm only going to include things that I know for a fact are not rare, that I know from my research and my interviews are absolutely common, that are representative of what's happening out there. So I actually steered away from a lot of the more serious types of extreme abuse
Mm,
that go on out there. And even I
yeah.
do have a chapter about hospital abuses and stuff, but those were not uncommon. So yeah, so it's just part of the context for how the book was written, that I want people to know these are not rare types of cases when I'm talking about an individual.
I mean, I'm thinking about just the number of people that I've talked to who have either been raped or sexually violated in a hospital, and then they were told, "Oh, you're bipolar, you're sexually acting out sexually, or you're hypersexual," or they just were denied that it happened, and they had to roommate with the perpetrator or be on the same ward with the perpetrator. That's a situation that I've heard from multiple different people, and I know that happens quite a lot. That there's sexual assaults that happen in inpatient units.
That's right. And that's in my book, because we have massive lawsuits of different types of framing, around the stripping, videotaping. There's all sorts of sort of
Mhm,
sexual harassment, you might call it. So
mhm,
so that kind of stuff. Yeah. And I found things that were more extreme even. I mean, one of the things I touch on, for example, that kind of gives you people a hint of the direction that goes, is there are sort of proven cases of people being detained under mental health laws, and then being sold into prostitution and slavery in America today. So these were cases that the Department of Justice actually outed and prosecuted, and people went to jail. But you're getting a sense that this is just so easy to do. And that's essentially what the Department of Justice was saying to me on the record in their interview was, yeah, we don't really know the extent of this, but there's no reason to believe that it's not more widespread. That's not a direct quote of anyone, but that was the sense I was getting, and you'll see that reflected in the interview.
If you introduce into a society a kind of extreme power that's unaccountable, it will be picked up for all kinds of very, very dark uses. And I mean, that's another thing that I've seen, and this is not talked about, and I'll just say it because it's just true. It does seem like the staff in many of these inpatient units, the staff that stick around, the ones that maybe even go for those kind of jobs, there is a certain kind of sadistic, cruel personality that gets drawn and plays out sadism, cruelty, and abuse as part of their own gratification. I know I have seen that. That seems to be a big problem. I know that's not politically correct. We're supposed to be building bridges with professionals, but a lot of these people should not be working in anywhere near human the services industry or helping other people at all, because there's a tremendous amount of abuse that happens because someone is enjoying doing the abuse.
And I think it's a dangerous position to put yourself in too, right? A very well-intentioned moral person can get into that position. And now that I have extreme, basically total power over another human being. Like, just take our relationship right now. If one of us is suddenly given total control over the other person's life, how long will it be before I'm making decisions that you're going to find are abusive, or vice versa, right? And in fact, will be by any objective standard of somebody looking at us, right, in that dynamic. And that goes to the Milgram study that you highlighted, or the Stanford prison experiment, which, yeah, I think that that's it. Because you have to look back at things like the residential school system for Indigenous people, and you have to wonder, how could so many of these schools been so brutal and corrupt and full of abuse? And you can't help but think it was doing both. It was attracting people who wanted to have that kind of power over children, and it was actually creating its own corruption, because in an environment where you have that sort of level of extreme power, a lot of people will naturally start to become a little bit more abusive without realizing it, because they have the power.
Yeah, it parallels the conversations about sexual abuse and brutality and torture that happens in the prison system. That to what degree is the context of the prison power imbalance sort of bringing that out of people, and then to what degree are the staff that stick around and stay with it the ones who are get some kind of gratification, certainly from their own abuse histories. There's no question. I don't believe that there are evil people. There are evil behaviors and evil things that get done, but this is a very, very, very dark topic. And it sounds like your book, even though it's very hard to read because of the extreme violence that it surfaces, that it's really there's actually a lot more that you didn't put into the book of things that you've learned about and things that have happened because they're so extreme that they don't fit into your priority of looking at the normalized and common that happens in the system.
Yeah, and it's important to highlight why, because it does just produce a reactive dismissal then, right?
Right.
Oh, well, that's just an extreme case. Yeah, it is.
The outliers.
I might have included them because to me they're still exemplar. They exemplify the kind of power, the extremes of this power, and the dangerousness of it. But I made a decision not to, because I didn't want to provoke that reaction, like, oh, you're just trying to paint everybody with this extreme brush, you know. So no, I tried to focus on more like, what are we seeing systemically here? And again, I want to say to any psychiatrist or any practitioner listening, like, yeah, I get it. Like, I interview practitioners for my book, and I'm really grateful to them. And they talked openly about their own mixed feelings in this area, and I think they add a great voice to the book. And so, all credit to those practitioners in the field who are willing to have these discussions and enter into those dialogues. But I really encourage them to speak out more about the kind of abuses you and I. It shouldn't really be us, right? It should be the practitioners who are saying, "Hey, we should not allow this." They should be the one demanding oversight standards and accountability in hospitals and places like this, not the patients, not the the outsiders, right? I mean, yeah, we're going to do it, but they should be the ones doing it. And I'm very, very profoundly disturbed by the ongoing lack. And in fact, the way the ones that do speak out actually get blowback, they get harassed, they get criticized, they have repercussions in their careers. Like that's just terrible.
Yeah, I spoke with a professional in Europe who said something that was really illuminating to me. She said that she doesn't want the power to lock people up. And I was thinking, well, wait a second, how does that? And she said, yeah, because the families and the society are expecting her to be the gatekeeper on keeping people so-called safe. And if she was prohibited from locking people up, it would give her a lot more freedom to do her work because she wouldn't feel like she was going to be blamed and have the finger pointed at her when someone kills themselves or when someone wrecks their life in a manic so-called manic episode, or they cause something really disturbing that happens because there wasn't an intervention, and then she's blamed for being the one. She doesn't want that power, and I thought that was a very interesting perspective.
Absolutely. And I've heard that too. And in fact, one of the psychiatrists in my book says that as much. She essentially says, you know, she's witnessed the incredible lack of rights that patients have and the weight of her word in these hearings, and says, yeah, I would much rather that these patients had really good legal representation and that it was a legitimate kind of hearing that truly took place, so that some of that responsibility was not upon me as the treatment provider, but was upon the judges to weigh in and really make a decision. But right now, by and large, judges just follow the lead of whatever the psychiatrist says. And this particular psychiatrist is in fact living by her word, and has been being an expert witness testifying in cases for patient for on behalf of the patients, basically trying to say, okay, here's my second opinion in this situation, and weighing in to try to at least provide a little more space and different points of view in the hearing room for a judge to hear, to put, you know, because that effectively will put pressure on a judge then to go, okay, I guess I better think this through and not just rely on the one psychiatrist who's giving me only one point of view on what should happen.
That's one of the things that we should think about is professionals reading your book and who want to do the right thing. What's their pathway? And there are organizations, there are other professionals out there, and I just encourage people to not be alone. You've been given this incredible privilege and power, and the esteem and the money in the marketplace that you've earned from this system. Turn it around and start using your voice. Join with other professionals. Join the movement to abolish forced treatment because you have that power and authority. Use it in the right direction. Don't just step away or throw your hands up or say, well, none of my all of my colleagues are going along with this, so it's not really my. That's the bystander effect. That's fundamentally how evil stays in place, is the bystanders don't speak up. So if you are a mental health professional, this book is absolutely for you, and hopefully this will inspire you and push you to say, I'm not going to be part of this. I'm going to join forces with other professionals and with the psychiatric survivor movement and the critical psychiatry movement that's saying no more. We need to have an alternative to this.
Yeah, let's give a plug to Jonathan Gadsby, the a leader of the Critical Mental Health Nurses Network out of the UK.
Mm.
He's advocating that nurses in psychiatric hospitals should have the right of conscientious objection to administering forced treatment, because he said he found himself in that situation a lot when he was working in a hospital. He found that, well, other people thought this person should be restrained and forcibly drugged, and his expert professional opinion was not. And yet he felt not comfortable constantly being the one to try to break from the team and all of that. So it was a great interview. I really appreciated his contribution to the book, as any of the other professionals and practitioners that spoke with me, whether anonymously or on the record, as he went fully with his own name. So yeah, like I think that's an example of the kind of thing, nothing else, it brings it into dialogue that, hey, there are nurses that care. And he highlighted for me at the same time a very chilling story where he now trains nurses, and he said, yeah, he observes in his students, the first time they see forced treatment in operation in their training, a lot of them just get out of it. They just quit. And he said, but unfortunately, who does that leave to do the job?
Chilling. It's a very disturbing image.
And as a result of that, extensive testimony and leadership. Let's give credit to Tina Minkowitz, the lawyer Tina Minkowitz, and a survivor. who has done so much work on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, testifying to the United Nations for many years. And not only her, of course, many groups and individuals representing people who have been subjected to forced treatment testified to the committee. Mind Freedom as well was involved in that process. So they testified to the UN committees, and in ultimately the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities declared that all people with any kind of disability should have equal rights before the law and should not be subjected to arbitrary detention on the basis of their disability. Those are two of the key criteria in the convention, such that it's now been declared that forced psychiatric treatment is a form of torture. And the World Health Organization has also taken that position. And that's a very hopeful development. It's a symbol that's out there. And since that time, both Canada and the United States governments have been repeatedly reprimanded by the United Nations and the World Health Organization for not doing more to begin reducing the use of forced treatment. And they are advocating abolishment of it altogether. And the World Health Organization has issued guidances to communities, highlighting in one case that I saw, probably other cases in all these many guidances they put out, but they highlighted AFIA House, Wildflower Alliance's AFIA House is one of the models that can be used, an emergency respite run by peers to help each other not end up in a psychiatric hospital. So highlighting examples like that of different approaches to this kind of stuff. And that is what we absolutely need more of. We do see organized effort by psychiatrists now to try to amend the CRPD or get rid of it altogether, because they are seeing the writing on the wall here, because this has engaged the disability movement in North America. And it's important to recognize that one of the fundamental things that Tina Minkowitz had highlighted at the United Nations was that whether or not you agree that you have a disability or agree that you have a mental disorder, quote unquote, is not the issue. The issue is somebody can impose that diagnosis upon you and you can be subjected to this laws. Therefore, everybody should be protected against them. So that was kind of her roughing in of how we might understand disability in this context, that I can be actively made disabled by someone else, even if I still don't think I am disabled, but that makes me subject to mental health laws, but also protects me with the CRPD. I am now a person with a disability in that sense. Even if I don't think I am, I am. And that's nice because I can now be protected by it. That's kind of loosely how she framed that argument. And it's been very helpful to understand how mental health laws work in this context. So moving ahead now, we have a wider understanding in the broader disability community that mental disability, as in mental disorders, can be understood in the same frame, and therefore the rights of those people should be protected, just as those of a person who cannot see, those of a person who cannot hear, those of a person who cannot walk also need to be protected. So too do the rights of a person with a mental health diagnosis of some kind.
So one of the things that's really remarkable about your book, Rob, is how you document, because a lot of it is hard to document because there isn't enough research and record keeping about what's actually going on, but how you document that actually the number of forced treatments is on the rise, that the number of people locked up is on the rise. This problem has not gotten better since the big push of psychiatric survivor movement activism in the 70s and 80s, and the kind of formal mechanisms that are supposed to protect human rights, like appearing before a court and having a certain process that goes on. And none of that has actually really reduced the problem. The problem has actually gotten worse, which was something that I've known intuitively, but it was very powerful for me to see that documented by your own research. So tell us a bit about that and what you discovered in writing the book.
There's a narrative out there that because asylums closed and from the 1950s to 70s, that now there's so few beds, the laws have become so strict and rights protecting that it's almost impossible to psychiatrically detain anyone, even the most quote unquote dangerous and severely ill can't be detained. This is the narrative that's out there. And what I discovered is this is a narrative that's been very consciously and deliberately put out there by Treatment Advocacy Center, pro-force psychiatrist E. Fuller Torrey, who have been bankrolled enormously by a billionaire, and that this narrative has been embraced very much by the news media because psychiatrists, by and large, find it helpful as well because it helps stir funding for the mental health system. And so they haven't really contradicted it. And also, nobody's really done a count. So it was just kind of floating out there. But I could see working in a community, there's no way that these large hospitals are accounting for everybody who's getting forcibly treated. I could see that visibly. So I'm like, what are those numbers? Who are these people? What are these institutions? What's really going on? And so what I discovered is, first of all, we know that the laws have been broadened everywhere across North America. They're very broad. They can virtually apply to anyone now. It's far beyond danger to self or others, which itself was very amorphous, because what does it really mean to endanger yourself?
Totally vague.
Yeah, but now it's just things like if you might mentally or physically deteriorate in some way which could make you committable in future. A very sort of Orwellian, what does that even mean type stuff. This is what's written into law now.
This is happening in California. They're rewriting the law to make it even less restrictive. So forced treatment is even more, because we already know that the laws aren't preventing forced treatment, but this is going to make the net even wider. And it seems like what is happening is that the society is moving towards force and incarcerating people because it doesn't want to deal with social issues like homelessness and poverty and the widespread isolation and the deterioration of our cities and communities.
So there's two crucial pieces. One is when I did get numbers, and it's very hard to get numbers. The people don't collect them, they don't release them. It's a mess. Wherever I managed to find actual numbers, I could see that they were skyrocketing. Like by that I mean doubling, tripling over the course of 5, 10 years. Everywhere I could find numbers in the last sort of 2 decades. So I had that evidence. And then with amazing coincidence and good fortune, researcher David Cohen and one of his PhD students, G. Lee, down at UCLA, did their own 5-year quest after numbers. And so they did far better than I did in terms of getting some stuff. And they released that study and showed that the same thing. It was doubling in lots of jurisdictions. About 22 states where they found continual data. It was accelerating at 3 times the population growth. So this is widespread across North America, that more people are being psychiatrically detained, and usually that leads to forced treatment. And I want to give one example, because those don't even touch, they're the tip of the iceberg. So this is an example that I don't recount in the book because it would have taken too long, but but in Maryland recently, which is actually the home of Treatment Advocacy Center, they had a political campaign to expand forced treatment. So I went and said, well, how many are you forcibly detaining now? They didn't know. Then the number came back. It was around 72 a year, something like this. I'm like, okay, I'm thinking this isn't right. Are you sure? They kept going, yeah, it's right, it's right. And then finally they went, oh, and now this is the government, right? It was this request went to their media, freedom of information people, multiple departments were all getting CC'd, telling me state of Maryland, 72 people a year, and it was me going, I'm thinking this number is right. Finally, I get actually, we have no idea what the number is. That's just for the state hospitals, right? And I'm like, yeah, okay. So who has the numbers? So in Maryland, they direct me to the public defender. The public defender said, yeah, it's more like 4,000. And then we had a back and forth about that. And about, okay, where are those numbers coming from? What have you got? And they agreed with me because I said, I don't think those are complete. And they said, yeah, we think you're right about that. We're currently in a process of trying to get the rest of the numbers, which is there was this vast pool of people who are being detained before they're formally committed. Right. So that legal process of actually getting a hearing and being involuntarily committed, people can be held for long periods of time before then.
Can be three days or 10 days, and then a lot of violence can happen in that short period.
Depending on the jurisdiction, yeah, a lot can happen. You can often, in certain jurisdictions, you can be forcibly drugged. Definitely if it's considered an emergency, though that's not defined. So yeah,
Mm.
so by the end of it, a year later, till we got the final numbers, it was more like 9,000. So now we've gone basically up from 72 people to 9,000 people per year in the state of Maryland, right? And is even that the full number?
And we should remember that the 72 number, which is completely a cover up, and it's being used to say we need more forced treatment, that's being pushed by the leading advocacy group that is claiming to speak on the behalf of the needs of people in emotional distress, which is this E. Fuller Torrey, the Treatment Advocacy Center, which is funded by essentially a fanatical, completely not related to anything that has to do with the research political agenda by a family member, the Stanley family, which has this very wealthy foundation, the Stanley Foundation. They've just been pushing basically a media message and a media lie for many, many years. And they're the ones that the media are focusing on and the legislation hears about. They're at forefront of the lobbying, they're at the forefront of policy making, and they're off by a factor of 72 versus many, many thousands at the heart of their argument.
Well, to be fair to Treatment Advocacy Center in this case, they weren't using any numbers. And they had that number 72, that was the first time it came out. And I'm not even, it was like 30, 72, somewhere around there, right? But the point is, the first time it came out was when I was sort of rooting around asking for it, right? And oh, okay, so the point is this. All this advocacy was going on. Yes, we got to forcibly treat more people, and nobody had any clue how many were currently being forcibly treated. That's the issue, right? They're operating in darkness.
So what's driving this, Rob? Because you said before, and this is something we have to remember, that lots of people are making lots of money off of this. This isn't just a failure of compassion. There actually is an incentive to put people in the hospital, because I've talked to so many people who were police come, they get locked up, they go into the hospital, they're there for 4 days, they're there for 6 days, they're violated, they're abused, they're forced into drugs. Finally, they come out and then they get a bill for the treatment that they didn't consent to. So this is a business model as well. Is that what you think is driving a lot of this? Is the financial combined with the stigma and the fear and the we don't know what to do about people?
Well, I explore this issue in the book. It was great that my publisher agreed that I could cover both Canada and the United States. Because what I said is we have these two very different healthcare systems,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
it's very interesting to see how remarkably similar they are. And so I do that in the book. And what we find is that it's playing out largely similarly in privatized healthcare, in the public system, in both countries. So something else is driving it. Now, definitely, I look at real blatant mass scale fraud for profit. That's absolutely occurring. It's absolutely on the rise. The Department of Justice is on the case. They have no idea the sheer scale of it. They didn't even want to talk about it, but they're prosecuting cases constantly. They're investigating cases constantly. There is widespread mass scale profiteering going on in involuntary mental health treatment.
You mean the providers just making up things or putting someone in the hospital without any real reason or just grabbing someone because they want to fill bed?
That's right. Just literally rounding people up,
Yeah.
going especially after vulnerable people.
Mm.
So they might go into homeless encampments, or they might go into halfway houses, support groups for mental health support groups or addiction support groups, and they might sell a story. They might literally just round people up. They give kickbacks in assisted living facilities to the operators of the facilities to take away people who might have severe dementia and lock them up and start billing Medicare and Medicaid.
But these are the excesses of this. This is not really the root of the problem. These are kind of like the fraud excesses
This
that
is
we're
like
talking.
what's gotten built on top, although we don't really know the extent of it. But I do want to give an example. So, Universal Health Services is the biggest psychiatric hospital chain in America, 200 hospitals. They're making billions of dollars in revenues off of those hospitals alone every year. They recently settled with the Department of Justice for $117 million for a number of their hospitals doing exactly what we're talking about, essentially Another mechanism for it, incidentally, was free mental health assessments. Come on in for a free mental health assessment, and then they were locking people up. And so they settled with the Department of Justice, and the press release lays it out. These people did not need to be locked up. They did not need these treatments.
So a settlement in the sense that the court ruled in favor of the plaintiffs and penalized them and made them pay $117 million because they had done all this fraud.
Well, UHS essentially signed off. I don't even know that that particular case even went to court in the end. It was a series of investigations. There were some whistleblowers involved. BuzzFeed News had done a series of articles about it back in 2016 that actually were part of what prompted, I think, the Department of Justice to look more deeply into it. But they're one of many. So there are a lot of other types of chains, smaller facilities, larger facilities involved in this kind of fraud.
So this is the excess that's happening on top of the root of the problem.
I think so. So my assessment of what's really going on is that it is a broader buy-in in our culture to the mental health system, because many people now are, they are going into it voluntarily, and they may feel that it's helping them in some way. And that's a very much part of a big mass cultural movement. And because of that, along with it, there's this belief that forced treatment must be helpful. And so it's being used. And as you pointed out earlier, what I also look at is there are also very concrete political uses for this. So one of them is the homeless population. We should be very clear. I think we don't have good data, unfortunately, anywhere, but my suspicion is, based on my research, that the homeless population that are getting forcibly treated is actually a relatively small group within the group that are being psychiatrically detained and forcibly treated. It's just one of many groups. So people need to understand that. That is, we aren't talking about homelessness. My book is not about homelessness, right? It's about a much wider spectrum of society. Like, one of the biggest groups that are being detained right now is actually school children, not homeless people. School children are being directed by school administrators and teachers up to psychiatric hospitals, and often police are being called to take those children up. Children as young as 6, as the Tampa Bay Times has reported, in Florida. So that's
Mhm.
an example. So it's not the homeless population only, but that's one of the areas where it's being clearly used for political purposes. Governments don't want to deal with their affordable housing problem, and even though it costs more to define it as a medical problem and put these people into medical care, costs much more than affordable housing would, they're going in this direction because either ideologically they don't agree with the welfare state or disability supports or anything like that, or they simply don't want to admit the failures of their economic policies.
Or also it's the path of least resistance. There's not pushback. There's no political force saying don't do this. So it just that's where everyone kind of ends up going.
That's right. Right. The homeless population does not have, a mass union with enormous financial clout that is lobbying in Washington and all the state governments. Exactly. So as a result, they're an easy target.
Yeah, psychiatric survivors don't have that kind of clout or lobbying either.
Yeah, and the best evidence for that is the vile prejudice you'll often see directed at those populations. It's easy and it's transparent in our society. It is a form of saneism, as Michael Perlin would call it. A lot of people call it now, like racism or sexism or other types of sort of real prejudice. You can see this sort of classist prejudice against the poor and the homeless and people who have addictions and things like that is directed. It's very visible in our society, and this is one of the ways that it also gets traction with governments. Like, yeah, get those people.
Yeah, and on the other side of it, there's the sort of the anti-prejudice or the anti-stigma folks who are saying, "Oh, we need compassion, we need caring for these populations," and then that gets twisted in. We need more services, we need more money into the nonprofit industrial complex. We need to actually have more treatment, and then the forced treatment comes in along with that.
Yeah, and to emphasize that, this is something I explore in the book as well, and I say that involuntary psychiatric detentions and forced treatment wed the conservative police state and the liberal nanny state in a very natural sort of way. They fit together very well.
Well said.
And that's just it. So on the one hand, you'll see forced treatment often portrayed as this is the compassionate thing to do. How could you, as a caring person, not do this? And really, the same day, if you switch to another media outlet, you can see it as we have to control these people. They don't deserve our compassion, right? And often, even within the same article, you'll see these two Orwellian double-think kind of points of view being sandwiched together as if they make some sort of logical sense.
And so into this goes the context of like either we're going to neglect these people because we don't care about them, or we're going to force them because we have this misunderstood nanny state view of what's actually beneficial. But I wonder whether this could be framed as sort of forced treatment, forced psychiatric care, becoming like a diabolical safety net. It becomes a way of catching the problems of the society without actually dealing with the problems of society, a little bit like the prison industrial complex is in some ways. And then I wonder whether you've thought about, well, what would it actually take to build a society? Because I know a lot of your work has been about community building. What would it take to build a society where we don't actually force people into these terrible dilemmas of either neglect or force? Are we just going to not help people? Are we going to forcibly inject them and assault them and put them into hospitals, where we're actually caring for people and creating communities? I mean, is this fundamentally about breaking the stranglehold that capitalism has in our society? What is the buy-in? What are the driving forces, and how do we unearth those and overcome them?
Well, I mean, the mental health system as a sort of policing tool has been operational like this for hundreds of years. So that's definitely an issue, sort of the what its function is in society, kind of capture people who are different and deviant and maybe not breaking laws, but we still want to control them, that tendency. But one of the key things I highlight and emphasize is it's just the medicalization that we've got going on that prevents us from at least being honest about what our intentions are and what's really happening. So we've got this big buy-in in our society to neurobiological thinking, and with that medicalization of all sorts of issues and problems and concerns and suffering and behaviors out there. So because of that, it's a big wide net, and out of that then comes the logic of force. Oh, well, if it's a medical problem, then we should correct it with a medical intervention. And so that's the danger. And I think that it's hard to get at it, but I think when you look at it in terms of how we're taking away people's civil rights under the guise of it, that's the wake-up call to kind of back up and go, should we be medicalizing everything? Because as long as it's all voluntary, well, why not? I've decided that I'm going to interpret my distress as a neurobiological problem and take a drug for it, and I'm happy. Why do you have a problem with that? You know, you can kind of make an argument like that. The problem, I then say, is, well, yeah, except you fomenting that point of view out there is leading to a whole slew of people who don't think like you do being subjected to the same drug, and maybe at a 10 times higher dose, and maybe 5 more drugs with it that they don't want and don't like and aren't helping them. That's the problem. And so we need to take the medicalization out of this. And that goes right to the legislation and the laws. So mental health law has clearly articulated that medical doctors are the supreme beings of decision making within this sphere. And consequently, all non-drug practitioners are subjected to this as well. You know, all patients are subjected to this. So nobody can really escape the medicalization net unless we rupture that right at the heart of the law. So that's where I kind of tackle it from a legal point of view.
So even in a slightly more socialized medical system, let's say Canada versus a predatory capitalist medical system, you still have the essential problem, is what I'm hearing, is that the medicalization of of social problems, and that doesn't allow us to think about whether capitalism is working or not working, because we don't even discuss the problems as social human problems like poverty and trauma and abuse and housing and jobs and supporting people in their lives. We think of it purely in terms of disease and medicine. So that's really the heart of it. And then what drives the medicalization in your view? Is it really the profit piece of it? Is it the fear piece of it? Is the entrenched cartel of the pharmaceutical doctor complex that's out there?
Everyone makes money in this space, right? Not the patient. The patient's the only one. The patient is being exploited financially throughout this system, right? So everybody's making money, whether they're operating in a nonprofit model or a for-profit model. So I think that's important, that livelihoods are at stake here, and lots of them. And that's another thing I show in the book. This system is not underfunded by any stretch of the imagination. It's about $220 billion a year in America.
Which system, the mental health in general, or
The mental health system more widely. So not just the involuntary treatment system, although that's a very big chunk of change as well. $220 billion every year. And in Canada, it's comparable, as in about $16 billion a year, given Canada's smaller size and cheaper healthcare system. In many places in Canada, it's worse than in the United States. And by worse, I mean the rates of forced treatment are higher. And that's
Hmm.
because everybody's got universal health insurance. So, nobody ever gets kicked out of the system,
Access? They have access, right?
right? Like they can in America. And I've heard people say, that thank God my insurance ran out.
That's what happened to me. Was at the brink of getting electroshock therapy, and my insurance ran out. And so, in a weird, twisted way, the capitalist in privatized healthcare system worked in my favor at that moment. And this, of course, underscores the folly of a more access equals better results framing of the issue, because you have this access and you have the funding in the Canada system, but it's producing more violence in some contexts.
Yeah, like everybody, the same arguments are playing out here. It's like everybody's claiming the system's underfunded, not enough people are being forcibly treated, and they're usually doing it, I'd say, again, with no numbers. They're just sort of spouting this. They don't even look at the numbers if they're there often. So this is what we have, is widespread buy-in to this way of thinking. And I think, there's so many issues involved. Like, one of the things I show in my book is trying to get at this. I'm showing here are all these different types of situations, institutions that use forced treatment powers, situations, families that are utilizing it, that are calling on it for all these different reasons. And so I don't think there's one simple answer to why is this growing. It's growing because, oh, guess what? This is a power that's readily accessible to an incredibly wide range of people to exert power over others and control others. And it's being utilized more and more and more for an incredible range of purposes. That's why it's a very dangerous set of laws.
Rob, how does this relate to prisons as kind of a dumping ground for social problems and homelessness and mental health distress? Because that's part of the discourse, especially in the United States, is we need more hospitals, more asylums, we need more forced treatment. Because hey, the police come and whoa, they could send you to jail. That's terrible. Oh, how humane. They brought you for an assessment. And so the police think that they're doing something humane. They often let people get off without charging them for criminal trespassing or disturbing the peace, or whatever it is, battery, and so it's a mental health issue. We're going to do the humane thing. So do you think that part of the appeal of this power of using forced treatment to get someone into the system is to kind of see it as an alternative to the also dark, torturous, horrific reality of the prison system?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think the prison system is now being used as part of the excuse to move people into the psychiatric system. And we didn't really talk earlier. I want to detail a little bit here. So where are these beds? So there are so many other beds that people don't talk about. There are private psychiatric hospitals. There are general hospital psychiatric wards. There are assisted living facilities, group homes, residential treatment centers. So ever since the 1950s, there's been this massive cultural investment in smaller types of facilities. And a lot of these facilities are actually full-on locked down facilities, or they're very, very coercive, meaning you are constantly being forcibly drugged, and if you stop taking it, you just sent up to the psychiatric hospital quickly to be put on those drugs again, and you're punished in that way. So that's part of this system.
We saw this so much in Northampton, Massachusetts, which is a relatively wealthy, very liberal, very do-gooder kind of community, and all the group homes and the assisted living and the places that we would visit people as part of Freedom Center, it was completely coercive. There was a constant threat of we're going to throw you in Cooley Dickinson Hospital if you don't follow the rules here in this supposedly caring community alternative.
That's right. And so the prison system now it's also a bit of a dumping ground. But what I found is the numbers aren't actually that high. So
Mm.
the numbers of people who are struggling with quote unquote mental disorders who are in prisons are pretty much what we'd statistically expect to see. It's really not that high. It's still a high number. It's a lot of people who are in prison that, are struggling with mental emotional difficulties. But it's not like they've become the dumping ground. No, what I found is there are far more people labeled with mental diagnoses that are in these other types of mental health facilities. So that's important to know. The other thing that's
Yeah.
important to know is this is actually being funded by the pharmaceutical industry. So this narrative right now, so there's some pharmaceutical companies that are philanthropically funding community initiatives to help people get the mentally ill out of prisons, quote unquote.
Right, right, right. Yeah.
And why are they doing that? Well, it's often the same companies that have injectable antipsychotics. So they know exactly what's going to happen. It will be persuaded that the best way to let quote unquote mentally ill person out of a prison is to give them a long acting antipsychotic injection that'll keep them tranquilized for a month at a time and just require them to report monthly, keep them heavily tranquilized this whole time. So they're standing to make ungodly amounts of money off of getting people out of these prisons and into the community. So that's one of the reasons there's a big push on for it.
And as we know, pharma in the US funds both sides of the aisle. Tons of money going to the Republicans, tons of money going to the Democrats. And you can't really cross what farm because it's cloaked in this, it's the humane medicine, healthcare is treatment, access is this humane thing, but it's a very twisted.
Yeah, the story is whatever you want it to be. If you need that, hey, we're gonna like control these dangerous people in the streets, that's the story they give you.
Farm is your friend. You want to control the crazies? Okay. You want to give good care to the crazies? We're your friends too. We're the friends of everybody. We're a big pharma.
Exactly. And of course that also plays out with the people who are pitching it. So not only pharma, right? But it gets buy-in from the culture because it's things we want to believe. It's an easier way of thinking about this kind of stuff.
I mean, that's part of the what I see just interpersonally with individuals that I work with is that there's just no alternative. There's nowhere to send your son, or there's no place for me to go, or my friend to go, or my family member to go. And it's the burden of making these decisions and the difficulty of care in the home and playing the role of the case manager and trying to figure it out. It's so psychologically inviting to be able to just offload all of that, like kind of like a guilt sponge or a responsibility sponge onto an authority and do the right thing. And then just hold on to this belief that's supported by the media and by the internet and by the whole society that, yes, this is the responsible thing to do. But it puts the family members, especially in this terrible, terrible position of being the transmitter of the violence. So often they're the ones that pick up the phone, or they're the ones that frame things in a certain way, or they're the ones who enforce the need to, because that's what they've been told to do. And they honestly don't see any other perspective out there. They don't see any other resources out there. It's so crushing for them, so many of them that I work with that have been through the whole cycle, and then they've woken up and they've said, well, actually, I realized that when we called the police and we called the hospital and we believed what NAMI was telling us, we believed what the DBSA support group was telling us, that medications are the answer and non-compliance means that the best thing to do is for the hospital, that they regret having done that. And then they're stuck like, well, where is the alternative? And it's so not there. And then my response is that, yeah, let's be honest that it's not there. And then let's get involved with activism. Let's get involved with making some change. Let's speak up. You're in a dilemma. Don't be isolated. Connect with other family members that are in the same dilemma. Be an ally to the psychiatric survivor movement, because there's no alternatives. There's no other options that are available for people.
Or the other options maybe aren't being funded, but that doesn't mean we can't create them. And I want to highlight just something that I cover in the book. So what I call funnels into detention that emerge from the community level. And then I'll return to what I think can be done at the community level differently. So people need to understand right now that we've talked about the homeless populations, and that also applies to homeless shelters, emergency shelters of different kinds, women's transition homes, rape crisis center type place. Like
college campus clinics.
These places all become funnels into hospitalization, the assisted living facilities, all sorts of supportive housing, as you said, because often the people working at them are trained. If somebody's acting strange, call the hospital, call 911. 911 and all these many mental health hotlines, helpline hotlines
Right.
are funnels in detention. They may trace calls and have people taken up to psychiatric hospitals by police. Workplaces, conflict resolution processes often result in the underling in a hierarchy of power being pressured into psychiatric treatment of some kind to try to resolve that conflict in the workplace. Nursing homes are another common place where people are being forcibly treated, and family conflicts. We've talked about those. The
Mm.
military and veterans, that whole area, wherever there's distress or misbehavior of some kind, a lot of these people are being funneled into psychiatric care. And then there's a whole slew of more political uses of this that I talk about in the book. But right down at the roots of our communities, we're all playing this role on a day-to-day basis in helping people end up getting detained against their will in psychiatric hospitals. And so that's what we got to change, is how we're reacting to the kinds of things that are emerging when we are in our relationships with others. Because all these funnels are emerging right down at the community level, that's where we also need to make changes. And so I also work and volunteer in an area of sort of what I'd call asset-based community development. Now, this was a movement founded by a guy named John McKnight, and I really encourage people to go out there and rediscover John McKnight. If you haven't, he's almost 90, I think now, but he wrote a terrific little book, The Careless Society Community and Its Counterfeits.
The Careless Society, very influential. Yeah.
It's a terrific little summary. Yes, he was influenced by Thomas Szasz and Ivan Illich and a number of other people who thought very critically about health and mental health.
Ivan Illich. Yeah. I did part of my undergraduate thesis on Ivan Illich. A very formative, important. Yes. Yes.
Okay, yeah. So I'm like saying John McKnight needs to come back into the heart of critical people who are thinking critically about the mental health system, because he did. And he's an icon to this day in the field of community development work still. He's very widely still known there. People who are interested in critical mental health should also be aware of his work. So I'm inspired by him, and I work with a couple of groups that do community work, which is neighbor to neighbor type or neighborhood based, bringing people together to sort of collaborate, using their strengths and assets, collaborate on helping each other and solving problems in their communities and stuff. And why this is so fundamentally important is McKnight's main argument is simply that we have over professionalized in this sphere. Suddenly now we can't help each other. Oh my God, you're having a quote unquote psychotic thought. Well, oh, the only person that can possibly deal with you is a medical doctor with a drug, and McKnight's way back at, wait a minute, this has been part of the human condition for time immemorial. Lots of people can flow in and out of these kinds of states all the time. Lots of people permanently live in them. That's fine too. How can we collaborate together? How can we live together? How can we help each other?
Yeah, this is what Ivan Illich called the de-skilling of society. We lose our skills and it gets replaced with commodities and gets replaced with bureaucracies, and we become more impoverished. So it's the modernization of poverty. We actually become less wealthy because we lose the things in the name of technologies and modernization and commodities in the market and progress. We're actually something very crucial about self-reliance and human to human, neighbor to neighbor connection, and our own capacity to do things ourselves gets stripped away from us.
That's right. And so often we're in this habit now of looking to government to solve all of our problems. But if you look at governments, they're probably creating so many now, and they certainly are not leaders. They tend to be followers. If you can get a good grassroots movement going that educates, that gets people concerned about an issue, often politicians can make a good decision and help that along, but they're often not leaders. And more, I think, maybe we shouldn't be looking to them for leadership on a lot of these crucial issues we're facing as a culture, as a society, and rather start building again from the grassroots up, and then encouraging and supporting our governments to follow along with these things. And so one of those now, for example, is this notion around the impacts of climate change, the kind of fears, that the apocalyptic sense that it can bring, as well as, they start asking, what can I do practically? How can I even just prepare for the next emergency that might emerge, whether it's wildfires or floods, but also over the long term for the kinds of radical changes that may be there. And you don't even have to think of it only in terms of climate change, because of course there are so many other issues that our society is confronting right now that also create great stress and difficulty for people at the individual level or at a group level. And so any of those you can pick, and then you start to go, what can I do with my neighbors to work on that particular issue that I'm really concerned about, that I think affects a lot of us? And so that's, we're trying to bring people together, and there's lots of other people around North America that are doing this kind of work right now. And one of the things you see in that environment is, quickly when people do come together to do that, as neighbors, people in a community, they get inspired themselves, and they start thinking, what else can we do together? It's like a revitalization of what democracy was supposed to be about, right? And that's exciting. And so why can't one of those things be, hey, how can we better help each other when we're really having intense emotional distress? Why not, right? What can we do? What do you need? What do I need when we're going through difficult times? What does friendship look like at that kind of level? And that's another term John McKnight likes to use. He said, my model is friendship, that we build friendships between more people, because often it is friends who are the ones that truly help us in these kind of really difficult situations.
Friends make the best medicine. Yes, this is very deeply influential in my own thinking about the work that I've done with Freedom Center and the Icarus Project. And I'm with you. I'm on board 100%. And I really like what you said, is that we can't sort of think of it in terms of what kinds of government services do we need, but we need to think about it as, how can the community's neighbors lean on our own resources that we have that maybe we don't even see, and then build these kinds of actually self-care, self-support. And the piece of that is, I think it does clash directly with the logic of capitalism, because if people don't have, for example, the time to go to meetings because they're working 60 hours a week, or you want to build a community center but all the land is controlled by large developers, or you want to put a space on your property so that you can have support groups meeting in their own community space, but the zoning laws, then the government can maybe has to play a role, some kind of progressive role of maybe clearing the way for community, rather than thinking of government services are the answer. Think of government as a way of a lever to create these spaces for community, because otherwise capital just moves in. I mean, I would love there to be a self-help network of people supporting each other coming off of meds. And there is, and it's growing, but that needs infrastructure. There has to be money, there has to be space. The people who tend to be the ones who are volunteering a lot, maybe they're retired or they're on a disability check, they have funds. What if we had universal basic income? What if we could free up the space to create these community alternatives? So in that sense, I would sort of see it in terms of questioning what's the role of capitalism in making these community changes possible, and how do we protect ourselves from the ravages of capitalism, because it prevents those kinds of opportunities. But I'm 100% on board with what you're saying. That's what we need to think about, is how can neighbor to neighbor connections actually start to create that self-reliance and connection, and including mental health, because part of people are asking this exact same question around policing and around poverty right now and homelessness. They're the same conversations, and let's bring in the mental health piece to that.
So I have two responses to that I think are important. One is, John McKnight honed his skills deep in the inner city of poor communities. So it's very interesting. And this is what we've observed too, that actually it's interesting, because if they're starting to talk about addressing what they're truly concerned about, and not necessarily what you came telling them they should be concerned about, they'll find the time and energy often to do it. That said, and I think that's just important because it's inspiring, but at the same time, John McKnight, certainly sees a role for government as well, and so do I. And like I don't want to dismantle in government entirely. I think it plays a very important role, particularly in the kind of society we have, for the reasons you're talking about. The flow of capital, right, is so distorting, and one of the functions of government can be to attempt to redirect that in disproportions in the flow of capital. But one of the things that John McKnight highlights is just that governments could be playing more a role of as facilitators of these kinds of spaces. So yeah, they can provide a space for people to meet. They could provide, and help them bring together, help facilitate. We found many people just appreciative that we had facilitating skills, for example. That's all they really wanted. Someone to help convene the meeting and run the meeting without creating a ruckus in the room, right? Allowing
Yeah.
people to resolve conflicts through a third party and things like that. That's all they really needed and wanted. And so that's enough, right? So that's the kind of thing a government could fund, to say, yeah, we're not here to tell you what to do, or we're here to facilitate helping you figure out together what you want, what would help you, and then you tell us. And if there is something, but it doesn't start based on the premise of how can government meet, your demands? Because often now that's the conflict. You go to government going, give us this, and governments are just in this pull with their own population, and it's just a battle zone. As John Menech says, it's hard. Yeah, it's hard to go to a meeting, a government meeting now, like a meeting with your government, where it just isn't people yelling at them about what they're not doing. And
Right.
so governments become cynical, and so do the voters, right? And is that healthy? Is that helpful, right? And so he's saying, how can we change that dynamic as well, where people are coming to say, the government's coming to say, how can we help? And the people are saying, yeah, like that's all. We just need a little assistance to do what we really want to do. We're not looking to you to solve all of the problems, right? I have a good friend that works at a supportive housing facility. It's essentially like a housing first facility. And that's really what it is, even though it is somewhat professionalized, government money's flowing through it and all of that. She highlights for me frequently how this is really needed. Like, these people are really struggling on a day-to-day basis just to kind of stay in their homes and to stay at a conflict with each other, whatever it is. So they play a role, but it's a facilitation role. It's just really being willing to get on the ground and go, okay, what is it? What's the issue? Okay, how can we do a workaround here? You're flooding your bathtub day in and day out. We can't have that as the managers of the building. Why is that? And what can you do? Okay, in the end, you're going to get a shower, and you're not going to have a bathtub because you're flooding out the apartment below you again and again and again. And it's just a simple little workaround like that in the end, right? And it's something that you wouldn't get mandated by government, right? It couldn't. It's like two people working together on the ground going, okay, let's do this, and we just won't tell anyone. Right? Because it wouldn't be legal, probably, right? You took away a person's bathtub? How dare you, right? But she's highlighting for me, you know what? Sometimes that's the solution that works for everyone.
What I'm hearing so much is that it's about listening, deep listening to find out what's going on. And just thinking about a situation where there's someone I know that goes in and out of the hospital just because her apartment is at the corner of this building. And so she's constantly interacting with the people going down the hall. And if they could just move her to a separate apartment where she had a little bit more privacy, there wouldn't be this conflict with the people in the hall, with the police getting called. So there's often those kinds of, and so what I'm hearing is I very much resonate with this, the idea of building the community capacity, listening to community needs, and helping communities have the capacity to take care of their own problems so that you don't have that attractor of let's call services, let's call the police, let's call mental health to kind of put people in the forced treatment machinery. And then there's this other side of it, which I think also you talk about in your book, which is the recognition that forced treatment is a human rights violation. Because if we can get if we can just have abolition, my position is we just need to abolish forced treatment. There needs to never be a psychiatric grounds for violating someone's due process right and locking them up. I just don't think I think we need to abolish that. If we could get the human rights angle established, and a lot of activists that I recently interviewed, Vesper Moore, this is what things we were talking about. If you could get the human rights aspect established, it will force the society to find these other options to sort of say, okay, well, this is off the table. What are we going to do instead? Well, let's take care of the problems in the community.
One thing when we talk about involuntary commitment, I think it's really important too that we separate out two different pieces of that puzzle. One is the detention. and one is the forced treatment. And I think that we could have a rational discussion as a society about, are there situations where we might want to intervene physically to prevent an adult who's not breaking a law, but we still want to prevent them from doing something physically? So that might be somebody running up and down the halls of my apartment building yelling at night. Like, maybe it's not really a criminal thing, but we might still want to stop that person. So that's one debate. And then the other issue is, well, should we be giving these people like powerful psychotropic drugs and electroshock and all of that, right? And I think if we separate those out, it becomes much clearer and easier to understand why forced treatment can be very bad and very destructive, and why even many survivors will say, oh, I understand why I was detained. And that might not be their biggest concern or biggest problem, right? Because if you can understand the intervention, that immediately makes it easier, right, for you to kind of process it emotionally.
The detention is often framed as a medical intervention because it's your psychosis. But if we just say, look, you were someone, you were found, you were trespassing, you were disturbing the peace, and you were repeatedly doing it, and so we intervened to prevent that ongoing crime from happening, that starts to make an honest logic to me. But as soon as we say, oh, well, we thought that you had a mental health crisis. We thought you were psychotic. So we detained you under the mental health laws for medical treatment, for evaluation, for psychiatric evaluation. That's why we removed you from the scene. Then you're back in Alice in Wonderland crazy logic. So I think that's really important to recognize that the other side of it, of course, is that there are situations where someone is acting in a disturbing or frightening, or maybe we're worried about them, and some response is needed. That's why I often think of it as, well, it's a false dichotomy between forced treatment versus neglect. There's this third path where, yes, if someone is repeatedly causing a disturbance, or they're repeatedly, some kind of response is needed. But can we use a nonviolent response that doesn't violate their rights in the name of some medical fantasy about what's going on for them?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and a good reminder too for me, like, because you can still, if you're being detained for a very explicit purpose, as you described it, that's one thing. But if you're detained but you're being medicalized in that act of detainment, that's now a new level of trauma that's being added to this situation. So let's really parse out, demedicalize this whole thing, and then talk about these two pieces of the puzzle. One is, yeah, is there's ever some reason where a physical intervention of some kind may or may not be warranted? And then separately, what about this whole issue of drugging people with tranquilizing medications? Is that a really route we want to go as a society?
And holding them against their will until they agree with the doctor that they're going to continue to take their drugs. And yes, I am sick. And Rob, what I'm seeing is that a lot of the prison abolition and alternatives to the police conversation, the Black Lives Matter movement, the George Floyd protests, the incredible anti-prison industrial complex movement that we have, a lot of the same conversations are happening. What do we do when someone is being disruptive? So what do we do when someone has violated someone, or there's something that's going on that the society, the community can't accept, but we don't want to rely on a prison system that's just going to make things worse and disempower the community. Are you seeing this new emerging conversation also happening in that context, as people are talking about decarcerating and getting the medical industrial complex out of the policing kind of equation that's going on?
I'm hopeful. It does seem to be occurring more than it was, even just 5 years ago, and certainly 10 years ago. There's been a definite upsurge in recognition. Uh, One of the examples that Tina Minkowitz pointed out to me was the Breathe Act that had been developed, and it clearly highlights and compares the prison incarceration system to the psychiatric incarceration system, and calls for them to be reduced and hopefully emptied. And so, yeah, I think that dialogue and debate is tremendously important. And indeed, that's what I want to highlight across my book, is one of the reasons I tried to show how many people this is affecting, is that all of those people hopefully will see each other as allies in this movement. So not just in the disability community, but also among a bunch of other communities that are being affected.
Yes, that was one of the disturbing things that happened in the US, is that there was such a huge outpouring of interest in police reform after the George Floyd protests. And the Breathe Act was one. It wasn't far enough. It wasn't certainly a solution, but that even hasn't been supported. That didn't get the political support from the liberals or the Republicans. The political equation is much more theater and opportunism. It seems like when it's in the headlines, it becomes something that politicians are willing to posture around. But actually, the power isn't there to make these real reforms happen when it comes down to it. So that's really disappointing. And I think a lot of people right now, in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests, are sort of asking ourselves, well, what do we need to do? Because we had this huge global uprising, really. And if even that doesn't get through, then something is really wrong with our democracy, and something very fundamental has to be looked at for the kinds of changes that are actually going to be needed to happen.
Yeah, like I say, hopeful in the sense that I'm hopeful that more ordinary people are becoming aware of the need for change in the sphere, because that even wasn't the case 10 years ago with people who were victims of psychiatric incarceration. They weren't even included in these discussions. Now they're included at least, and that discussion overall is becoming more common in our society. But yeah, absolutely, we're not seeing it get the kind of traction we would hope to get at the level of actual government action, and that's still a ways away apparently, and it's really unfortunate. But you see that very visibly, because even in these cases I talked about earlier of blatant fraud that were outed in the newspapers, of psychiatric incarceration that was blatant fraud, governments would hem and haw and, well, because, well, these people really are mentally ill, can we really trust them? And it was only when, like, the medical director of the facility literally said, yeah, this is what we're doing, we're, like whistleblowers from within, that governments finally took action, right? There's cases of that where the news media coverage for 2 years was brutal, but the place kept its licensing. And so that goes to entrenched government powers that are reluctant to change. And yeah, that's a democratic issue.
Yeah, there's a real failure of democracy. We talk about this quite a bit, and the problem of regulatory capture, that the oversight agencies like the FDA, for example, like the Department of Justice, like the different agencies at the state level, are manipulated, controlled, corrupted, dominated. They serve the interests of the very forces that they're supposed to be overseeing. So that's is a fundamental crisis in democracy, that I see the forced treatment issue as being very intertwined with that. And I think the solutions are going to come in on a broader and more fundamental basis, I think. Is there a country or an example of a place in the world that really has taken the rights-based perspective to heart and has backed off from forced treatment and is creating something different?
Not that I'm aware of yet at the scale that you're asking. So certainly, the World Health Organization has highlighted these pockets of examples around the world, and I encourage people to look at those because, yeah, when we talk about alternatives, they're working within the models of the existing systems, and just looking at reform, right? And saying, okay, what could we do differently at a psychiatric hospital, even? So they're not talking about full on abolishment of the entire mental health system at all, right? They're not going that far. They're talking about just adjustments, but they are pretty revolutionary in the sense that they're rights based. They're truly saying, how can we do this in a way that respects the wishes of these individuals? That said, what I found out during the course of my research, and this is really new news, I'm not even sure that they've issued the report yet, but the European Union of, trying to translate it from the languages it's usually written in, but the European Union of Medical Societies, so the oversight body for all the medical societies of Europe, a very big organization, 1.5 million members and whatnot, and they have a psychiatry division. The union itself, with a new president in charge, issued a statement to me saying, we are going to issue a report on best practices in voluntary care in mental health. So they have abandoned entirely the involuntary treatment. So that's major. So if that does come out, and I don't know if it has yet, I haven't seen it, but when it does, that'll be another document that's pretty significant, like the CRPD, and that will allow people to use it as leverage to say, okay, countries really got to start changing.
So you're saying that they backed off the idea of let's justify forced treatment and they just said, look, there isn't any justification for this. Let's just go with replacing it with voluntary treatment. And that this happened on a European wide medical organization that's representing all these different countries.
Essentially, yes. Yeah. And so I'm hopeful that it sounds like they're going to be in line with what the World Health Organization has done. So that's something, right? These are pretty significant organizations and groups that at least makes for a good story. And hopefully, you can use that because I use it, right? When I talk now, I think it does carry weight in legislators' minds and in the general public's mind. And so I do think as a symbol, if nothing else, it might help us move ahead.
So Rob, we're just about out of time on Madness Radio. So just remind people the name of your new book and also how they can get in touch with you if they want to get in touch with you.
So the book is called Your Consent is Not Required: The Rise in Psychiatric Detentions, Forced Treatment, and Abusive Guardianships. And anybody can reach me through my website, which is just my name.com. So robwipond.com, and there's contact information there. And the book's available basically everywhere. I mean, I encourage people to support your local bookstore, and it also makes the bookstore aware that my book exists if you order it through your local independent bookstore. But of course, it's available online. And I encourage people also to ask your local library to order the book.
Yes, I can't say how grateful I am for you on Madness Radio today and also for your work. This is a tremendous, tremendous accomplishment. Your book is extremely vital reading, and just congratulations and thank you for the work that you've done, Rob.
And thank you. It's a great conversation today. I really appreciate it. And for Madness Radio, it's been a great contribution in this space for people to learn and discuss these issues.
You've been listening to an interview with Rob Wipond. Rob is a freelance investigative journalist who writes frequently at the interfaces between psychiatry, civil rights, policing, surveillance and privacy, and social change. His articles have been nominated for 17 magazine and journalism awards for writing in medicine, science and technology, business, and law. He has taught journalism and creative nonfiction at the University of Victoria and Royal Roads University, and also works and volunteers with nonprofit groups who do neighborhood community building. That's all the time we have on Madness Radio. Thanks for tuning in. What does it mean to be called crazy in a crazy world? Listen to Madness Radio, voices and visions from outside mental health.